Hi, friends, and welcome to the Objective Hindu. In the second part of my analysis of the Waqf Amendment Bill, I want to talk to you about the existing law and what are some of the very serious problems with it. In the first part, I gave you a deep background of what is a Waqf and why it exists and why we need it, and some examples of rampant misuse of the existing laws and how that's ended up with some very ridiculous claims that the Waqf boards across India have made. So in this video, I've got some notes here. I'll talk to you about some of the very peculiar, I would say almost extra constitutional provisions that the existing Waqf Act has, and the powers that it bestows upon the Waqf board, the Waqf tribunals, and the whole mechanism and machinery. So, firstly, the responsibility to register, maintain a list of all Waqf properties and work with the Waqf boards in every state is of the state government, which means that the state government has to pay for all this. Which is very interesting because the state government is not obliged to do anything like this for any other community. So then it begs the question as to why you as a taxpayer need to pay money to figure out which property is Waqf, which is not Waqf. That should be something that those people have to pay, since they have specifically asked for those properties to be treated outside of modern and standard property law. So I think that's definitely a problem. And that's an aberration of a general principle that exists in the current law. The second one is very interesting. There's a little bit of misinformation about this. This is this idea that when something is notified as a Waqf property, there's obviously a process to be followed, but that process is highly discretionary and it's very easy and very powerful. It's very easy for the Waqf board to essentially decide to notify a property as a Waqf property. They need to do this via a publication in the state's gazette. Now, what happens is that because often the properties that are being notified as Waqf properties, as I've described in the first video, are not individual properties. So forget about any Mr. Khan giving his property into Waqf. That's a rare and a small circumstance. Majority are what I described earlier, Waqf by users, where historically, for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, there's been some connection with the Muslim community, and the Waqf board has claimed that land to be Muslim land and claimed the administration of that land. Now, because that land was never owned, like I gave you the example of Taj Mahal or the Eidgah in Bangalore, because that land was not owned by an individual, when the Waqf board notifies that land as Waqf land, the same thing happened, by the way, in Tamil Nadu, right? Where they notified the entire village as a Waqf property. Now, because there is no one owner of the village, they are not obliged to, in such cases, tell someone about the fact that your property is now a Waqf property. Now, this is, again, it's sometimes a little misleading. If it is an individual property, they don't need to tell it because, of course, then you have given it to them and there's a Waqf deed. But like I've said, majority of cases, it's not an individual property and it's some sort of a community property, a public good that has been claimed rightly or wrongly as Waqf property. And since there is no party on the other side, they just notify it in the Gazette, which means if you have not been reading the Gazette every morning or whatever, every month, you will not even know that something that you have a stake in has been converted into Waqf property. So this is what happened with the Bangalore Eidgah, and also in the case of the village in Tamil Nadu, where the gentleman who was trying to sell his land and then eventually found out that this whole village is part of a Waqf, was never told that his village is part of a Waqf because he doesn't own the village. It was somewhere in some notification that this village, which of course no one's reading those notifications because it's ludicrous to wake up in the morning and check whether where you live is now suddenly part of a Waqf or not. But somewhere in that notification, it said that village is now a Waqf property. And until someone actually had to do a real transaction, no one realized it. So this is a big problem, because then that means that the person who might be aggrieved or might be hurt as a consequence of your actions does not have, the onus is on that person to somehow magically figure out that this is what's happened to them. And then this becomes particularly problematic. And this is now, I'm moving to the next point, but they're intricately linked, where there's a limitation where any challenges to such notifications have to be done in 1 year. Otherwise, they're barred by law. So, in civic law, especially in property law, there's the concept of limitations, right? Which is that you can't just arbitrarily get up one day and say that I'm fighting for something from 70 years ago. The court will say, sorry, it's too long ago. You should have come then. That's the idea of limitation. Now, under the current Waqf legislation, let's say you notify something in the Gazette, and so this village which was notified in the Gazette, and let's say no one took any particular objections to it, which, like I said, no one would, because, well, no one in the village just gets up and reads the Gazette, and anyway, none of them claim to own the village in the first place. When it's time to actually challenge this notification, they are now being told that it had to be done in the first 1 year, because there's a 1 year limitation on challenging the notifications by the Waqf board. So that's a third major problem with the current legislation. But by the way, I think I mentioned this in the first video, Gyan Vapi and the Krishna Janmabhoomi have both been declared as Waqfs. And in many cases, and I'm skipping the details because it gets very detailed, in many cases this is being done very specifically by those Waqf boards, often under pressure by the All India Muslim Personal Law Board, or one of those quasi-sharia organizations that still exist in India, to use the powers of the Waqf boards to notify something and then hope that nothing happens in the first 1 year, and then use the fact that the limitation rule applies after 1 year in their favor. So a very sort of subversive use of the existing legislation, I'd say, has happened in many cases, including in the Krishna Janmabhoomi and the Gyan Vapi Masjid case. Later, by the way, so the Supreme Court, someone had gone, like, I don't remember whom, had gone to the Supreme Court on this limitation question. And the Supreme Court had very interestingly said that the limitation does not apply to non-Muslims. Now, this firstly begs a question as to why are non-Muslims even part of this? For that, you can thank Rajiv Gandhi and the 1995 amendments, where essentially if a property is declared a Waqf property, and let's say I go and I say, no, how can this be your property? Waqf property is my property. And let's say I'm not a Muslim, even then I need to go to the Waqf tribunal I'll be adjudicated, and my case will be adjudicated based on the tribunal's laws, which include the 1 year limitation. Now, Supreme Court said that in cases where the person who's contesting this, let's say in this example myself, is not a Muslim, then they're not bound by the 1 year limitation, which, by the way, was a very wise thing to do, because that would then account for the people who had no idea. Because, of course, if you're a Muslim, it's very likely that you were the person who had given it, or you're part of that community. So you can argue that, okay, why were you asleep for so long? I would say it's still too short. But certainly for non-Muslims, it doesn't make any sense to say that, oh, you should have come in the first 1 year to this tribunal, which is specifically to monitor and govern the Waqf properties, not to the court. You have to go to the tribunal first. So the Supreme Court had ruled this, and then the Congress government, I think in 2013, changed this again and essentially took that away. And so as it stands today, even if you're a non-Muslim, you will be bound by these laws. So this is very important, it's not just a law for the Muslims, by the Muslims, for their stuff. It is now a law that applies to vast swaths of land in India, which may or may not be legitimate waqfs, and also extends to people who are not part of the Muslim community, despite there being obviously the ordinary courts that you and I should usually have access to, but not in these cases. So that's a big anomaly, I'd say. Just looking through my notes here now. I've mentioned that so every 10 years a survey needs to be done. by the state government, the Waqf board, but the Waqf boards can notify any property in between those surveys as well. And like I said, those are quite arbitrary, those powers. Um, the Waqf board can instruct the district magistrate to remove any encroachments. This is basically what was attempted in the Taj Mahal case, where the Waqf board said that ASI is an encroacher, so please leave because the Taj Mahal is a Waqf property and all that sort of nonsense. But by law, the Waqf board has the important point here is that it's got power to implement its decisions. So not only can it decide that something belongs to someone, they can also use the existing state machinery, in this case, the district magistrate, to evict someone from there. Now, something very interesting happened in, I can't remember which year, but when the partition of India happened, a lot of Muslims left their properties. Now, I'm talking about, in many cases, individual properties, right? Especially in Punjab and northern India and UP. And when they went to Pakistan, the same thing happened in Pakistan, even in greater numbers, where when the Hindus and Sikhs left, those properties were empty, and they were often then used to resettle, in Pakistan's case, the immigrating Muslims, and in India's case, the immigrating Hindus and Sikhs. And there used to be a law for this. It was called the Evacuee Property Act. Now, these are just people's homes, etc. It's got nothing to do with Waqf. But Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, in all his secular glory, decided to award many of these properties to the Waqf. So what then happened is that people who, there was a quid pro quo sort of arrangement, and there was an expectation that, if Muslims are leaving, those properties need to be given to help to resettle the Hindus, which was done. But, there was no property transfer or anything at that stage, because firstly, we didn't really have very good documentation. Those people didn't have identities. The people who had left had, obviously not given any papers or intimation about what they want to do. Neither had they given them into Waqf. They had just left. So really, there should be a provision to, reallocate those to the refugees. And that's what the Evacuee Act was meant to do, Evacuee Property Act. But Rajiv Gandhi said that, no, these are all Waqf properties, under pressure, obviously, from our Mullah Maulana friends. And what happened then is that a lot of these properties, especially in northern India, became Waqf properties, which means they were registered as Waqf by the board, which means you as a Hindu or a Sikh who is living in those properties now suddenly became a tenant in a Waqf property, which is permissible by law. But remember what I said in the previous point, the Waqf board then, A, can decide what the rent is, and B, evict you if they choose to. So I think this was absolutely ridiculous, because none of these properties were Waqf properties. They were not given into Waqf by the people who left them. They should have never been given over to the Waqf board by Rajiv Gandhi. And the people living in those properties should have first claim to those properties, given the consequences of partition. But this is also one of the challenges that needs to be addressed via the amendments, which it may or may not be able to do, in all honesty. I mentioned briefly that the decision of the tribunal and the Waqf board is binding, which means you cannot go to your local court against anything that the tribunal has decided. So if the Waqf board appropriates your property, you can go to the tribunal. The tribunal, by the way, it's got a composition, a structure, and it's got basically a qazi or a Muslim jurisprudence expert sitting over there. And of course, they're going to very often rule in the favor of the Muslim community based on their interpretation of Sharia law, which is hardly secular. But you have to go there, including as a non-Muslim, and you can't go to anyone until you get a verdict from there. Once you get a verdict from there, then you can go to the High Court. So imagine your property is, let's say, taken over. That guy in Tamil Nadu who's trying to sell his legitimate land, he was told to go to the Waqf board to get a no objection certificate. The Waqf board denied him that. Then he went to the Waqf tribunal. Now, remember what I said about the number of cases at those tribunals. It might take 10 years for someone to give a decision. Let's say the decision is not in his favor, which is very likely, because if that property has been notified as a Waqf property, the tribunal just has to stand by it. But let's assume that the tribunal says, no, this is Waqf property and you can't sell it because it's not yours. Then at that stage, the person can go to the state's High Court, in this case, the Madras High Court. So it gives the Waqf board and the tribunal a lot of power. And in a broken system, in a broken judicial setup such as India's, it denies people the legitimate opportunity to actually go and redress their grievances via the standard sort of court mechanisms. Okay. Another interesting one is that the members of the Waqf board, the administrators, the mutawalli, who's essentially the person who looks after the property, etc., these are all deemed to be public servants. Remember, I said that the state has to firstly pay for all the surveys and all the maintenance and registers. And these people are also public servants. So the Waqf board, the mutawalli, their salaries are paid by the state government, so with your money and my money. And also remember, if they're a public servant, they're protected under law. At the they're treated at par with, let's say, a police officer, or I don't know, a collector or an IAS officer. So if you get into a scuffle or something with a mutawalli, who's basically the guy looking after the graveyard, you would be tried in court as if you had a physical scuffle with, let's say, a police officer, which is, I think it's firstly stupid, because it should just be between as two individuals. And secondly, no such provision exists for any non-Muslim member across India. So the Jathedar of the Akal Takht is not a public servant. So Shankaracharya is not a public servant. The head of the Tirupati Devasthan is not a public servant. But the mutawallis and the Waqf board team and the administrators, they are public servants, and they're paid for by the state, which I think is outrageous. It's just basically subsidizing one community at the expense of others. I've already explained Waqf by user. That's one of the main challenges, and the amendment seeks to redress that. I don't know how it will actually undo some of the damage, but Waqf by user is one of the existing provisions in post 1995, where the Waqf board does not require a Waqf deed to notify something as a Waqf property, as they have in the case of Taj Mahal or the Bangalore Eidgah. And that's absolutely an aberration in my opinion. I actually found a real video of, it was not clear which property it was about, but essentially the arguing lawyer representing the Waqf board of that state was asking the judge to evacuate the ASI from that property because that property was notified as a Waqf property. This is a real case, and there's actually a video online. I'll share a link of that video. It's worth watching. The judge is a Sikh gentleman, and he has a lot of fun at the expense of that lawyer as well. And then the other counsel is from ASI. And essentially the argument is that, the arguing lawyer is saying that this is Waqf property, ASI is an encroacher, so you should leave. And the judge says, are you out of your mind? Why don't you declare all of India as a Waqf property and we can all leave? But the fact of the matter, if you know about this topic enough, is that is because the judge is using his discretion. The lawyer who's making the argument is actually making an argument that is fairly in line with the letter of the law. The judge is using what's often called the spirit of the law. But you can't always rely on the spirit of the law to do the job. The letter of the law also needs to change, which is what the amendments are trying to do at the moment. But it's worth watching this video. It's very funny. It's a real video from a court, and it makes no sense to the judge when he's hearing the argument that the arguing lawyer is making, asking ASI, which is basically a non-partisan government body only responsible for protecting our national monuments, to vacate that particular space. So I'll share that link with you as well. So in summary, again, it's a problematic set of laws, and that's because it goes back a long time. I said in 1913 they created the first law which just recognized waqfs. In 1925 there was a little bit of a mechanism, and then in 54 we created the first actual set of laws in India, in post-independent India, and then in 1995 it was given a lot of power. And I think in between 1995 and 2024, a lot of misappropriation of land has happened, and it's been the Waqf boards and tribunals have been given way too much power, and their decisions are binding on all citizens, including non-Muslims, which should never be in the case, and all these things should be challenged. Now I'll see if I'll probably create a third video to round this off and talk about the the amendments. But very briefly, as you can imagine, the amendments try and redress some of the anomalies in the law. One way to think about it is that the anomalies and the problems that I've listed, the amendment tries to fix those. It doesn't go as far as we would like it to. When I say we, people who are watching this issue closely and are not necessarily very inclined to live in a Sharia rule state, but it is definitely a big step in the right direction, and it is a step, I would say, that was it's a step that was a necessity for the good of our country. It is not a step that's going to bring any electoral sort of dividends to the BJP, and I love that about this particular step. It's not a public issue. It's not an emotional issue. Most people don't even know what the Waqf Act is. Most people don't care what's going on, although they should. So the fact that BJP has gone after this, I think it deserves, congratulations from all of us, because often otherwise all governments are often just looking at what's the next issue to be tackled that can help them either win power or stay in power. And I don't think this particular issue will help them achieve either of those objectives. I think they need to do other stuff for staying in power. But I really welcome the commitment and the efforts that the ruling dispensation has made to pick up this very tricky and difficult to solve problem, and is now dealing with, obviously, the noises that the Muslims and the secular parties, so-called secular parties, are making without really understanding the crux of the problem, which of course is expected given their sort of political objectives. So I hope across these two videos I have been able to explain to you what this whole deal is about, and why this act needs to change, and with the various anomalies. If I have a chance, I'll create a third one going through the various amendments that the new law has proposed. I might wait for the Joint Parliamentary Committee to finish its work, because it's possible that I make the video and then they revise something and then I'll have to change what I've said. But hopefully these two give you a reasonably comprehensive picture of the challenge and why you and I should both care about trying to find a better mechanism, a better solution to address some of these challenges. If you like the videos, please do share them with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Thank you and have a great day.